Hello, my name is Clare and I work in Durham University in the UK in the philosophy department. In this video I'm going to tell you about the pioneering British moral philosopher Mary Midgley. Midgley died in 2018 at the age of 99. She wrote 18 or 19 books, depending on how you count, with her first book, Beast and Man, The Roots of Human Nature, written when she was 59. Inspiration for those of us who may be latecomers to philosophy or who have philosophical ideas brewing. As I'll explain in this video, much of Midgley's later work springs from Beast and Man, including her influential idea that philosophy is necessary to human life. Midgley was born Mary Scrutton in 1919. Shortly after her birth, her father, Tom Scrutton, became chaplain at King's College Chapel in Cambridge. The family didn't stay long in Cambridge. They moved to a rectory in Greenford, now in Greater London, when Midgley was 5. In her memoir, which I recommend, The Owl of Minerva, Midgley says that the real business of her early life began with her discovery of its garden. That was where she first experienced in herself the deep biophilia or love of life and living things that would resurface in her early midlife, in her 30s, and come to shape her philosophical thinking. Midgley came from a family of educated women. Her father's sister Jane had studied history at Girton College in Cambridge, and 3 of her mother's aunts had qualified to teach in the 1880s. This included her aunt Jeanie, whose copy of Darwin's 1872, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, was given to Mary after Jeanie's death. Midgley's secondary school was Down House, the country home of Charles Darwin, where that very book had been composed. Midgley went to Oxford in 1938 to study mods and greats, 5 terms of classics followed by 7 terms of philosophy. She'd been in Vienna earlier that year to learn German and had seen Nazi tanks rolling into the centre of the city. Later, her Viennese hosts fled to England and took refuge in her parents' house. On her first day at Oxford, Midgley met Iris Murdoch, the philosopher and novelist. Both were at Somerville College and the pair became lifelong friends. Their tutor was Donald Mackinnon, later a professor of theology at Aberdeen and Cambridge. He was a conscientious objector during the war, and he conveyed to all his students the seriousness of philosophy. Another of his tutees was Philippa Foot, a year below Mary and Iris at Somerville. She too went on to become a distinguished moral philosopher. Elizabeth Anscombe, the towering metaphysician of action and mind and translator of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, was a year above at St. Hugh's. She would occasionally visit Somerville, which is where Midgley recalls first meeting her, in the dining hall. She pressed Midgley on the nature of Plato's forms. Midgley remembers saying to herself, "That woman is worth cultivating." The war and its aftermath is the inevitable backdrop to the philosophy that each of these thinkers went on to develop. In various writings, Midgley has attributed their distinctive philosophical orientation to the education they received during the war when numbers of male students dropped. Many of their lecturers were Jewish refugee scholars who had fled Nazi Germany, and they were often taught in seminars, a German style of class that was unlike the traditional Oxford tutorial. She has said that in those wartime classes, which were small, students were more interested in understanding this deeply puzzling world than in putting each other down. Here referring to a way of doing philosophy that encourages, in her words, a lot of clever young men to compete in winning arguments. In general, it might be said that her philosophy aims at synthesis, an approach that resonates with that of R.G. Collingwood, the Waynflete Professor of Philosophy and father of her friend Ruth. She attended some of the last lectures he gave before his death in 1943. Collingwood distinguishes euristical from dialectical methods in philosophy. The euristical method involves assuming that there are 2 opposing positions and only one is right or true. The dialectical model takes it that apparently opposing positions both have some truth in them, and the task is to view each one from a perspective that can sift and incorporate what is true in both. This requires understanding and not opposition. After graduation, Midgley undertook war work in the civil service in the Ministry of Production and briefly taught classics at a boys' public school. She left on the day it was announced the Labour Party had won a large majority in the post-war election, and she returned to Oxford. She became secretary to the illustrious classicist Gilbert Murray, but she slowly found herself being drawn back to philosophy and more particularly to what she called large-scale metaphysics. In 1947, she started work on a doctoral thesis on Plotinus' psychology of the self. The ego is first used as a philosophical term in Plotinus' Aeneid, which perhaps goes some way to explaining the frequent mention of Freud and Jung in Midgley's later work. Like Plato, Plotinus believed there was, and now I quote Midgley, a far vaster and more serious reality lying behind the everyday scene around us. Unlike Plato, however, Plotinus did not denigrate the sensory or everyday world as mere appearance. Instead, he wanted to find a wider, more inclusive perspective that could show the continuity of the physical and the spiritual. Midgley never finished her thesis, but we are lucky that the manuscript survives and is in the archives here at Durham University. Midgley was not religious, but she certainly regarded as spiritual the need that humans have for understanding. The attitudes that belong to any attempt at understanding the vastness of the truth are, for her, religious attitudes. Though they can become misdirected, we can place our entire faith in science, for example, ultimately they are contemplative. They are reaching for some glimpse of what is whole. In Midgley's nature, in her mature metaphysics, it is this living planet, Earth, a self-regulating and sustaining biosphere of which we are part, that should direct our attention, be the proper object of our awe, our reverence, even our gratitude. Mary Scrutton married in 1950 with Iris Murdoch as her bridesmaid. I'm now going to tell you a bit about her philosophical ideas, starting with some of her earliest writing. By the time of her death, Midgley was one of the foremost public philosophers in the UK. But even in the 40s and 50s, her abundant flair for public philosophy was clear. She began writing radio scripts for the BBC, which were subsequently printed in the Listener magazine. Some drew from her thesis on Plotinus, including the 1951 The Natural History of Contradictions, the byline of which reads, Mary Scrutton on Paradoxography. In this article, we get a taste for her sensitivity to conflict and, of course, paradox and logical inconsistency and its sheer ubiquity in human life and thought. We see here her early and sharp departure from a style of linguistic philosophy that is ruled by the Wittgensteinian slogan, everything that can be said clearly. Far from it, she said. There are many, many human truths that cannot be told without paradox or metaphor or without wit or poetry. This is particularly true of the practical reformer who may even be a philosopher. Man is free, but is everywhere in chains. Not all her radio scripts were welcomed. Sometime in the early 1950s, Midgley wrote a piece called Rings and Books, which listed all those great canonical philosophers who were bachelors. The list is long, and she wrote, quote, I do not cram the groaning scale with monks and friars, because there's always the chance that they had some other reason besides philosophy for joining their orders. On the married list, only Socrates, Aristotle and Hegel are named. She admits she may be wrong in the details, but the figures are significant. Not only is our inherited philosophical tradition shaped entirely by men, on her reckoning, but mostly by bachelors. She goes on to query, why is it that we are stunned by Descartes' discovery of the cogito? Her diagnosis? It appeals to the adolescent philosopher in all of us. Descartes meditating in his dressing gown alone by his stove is not unlike an overly intense teenager holed up in his or her bedroom, she thinks. Mature people living a normal domestic life could not regard the existence of other people as something that must be inferred. The script was rejected by the editor with a cursory assessment, a trivial, irrelevant intrusion of domestic matters into intellectual life. But of course, Midgley was trying to contest what intellectual life itself consists in and where it lies. Let me quote from Rings and Books so you can get a flavour of her protest. Philosophers have generally talked as though it were obvious that one consciousness went to one body, as though each person were a closed system which could only signal to another by external behaviour, and that behaviour had to be interpreted from previous experience. I wonder whether they would have said the same if they had been frequently pregnant and suckling, if they had been constantly faced with questions like, what have you been eating to make him ill? That the lived bodily experience of a woman can be a source of knowledge and philosophical insight explains her sweeping conclusion. She writes, an account of human knowledge which women's whole experience falsifies is inadequate and partial and capricious. The married Aristotle fares slightly better in Midgley's estimation. His ideas, she thinks, do have all the free movement of maturity. Despite his general assumption that men's function and virtue is greater than women's, his attempt at understanding was not so partial as to cut off, as irrelevant, the experience of half the species. Midgley and her husband, the philosopher Jeff Midgley, had 3 children together. After their marriage, they moved to Newcastle in the northeast of England, where Jeff had a position at Newcastle University. Midgley had given up a teaching position at the University of Reading in order to join him, and was not immediately anxious to return to the lecture podium. Instead, she wrote book reviews for the New Statesman, while continuing to write articles for established philosophical journals. By then, Midgley was already on the philosophical path that would lead to her mature philosophy. In her 30s, she read Konrad Lorenz's King Solomon's Ring, a canonical work of ethology, or the study of free-roaming animals in their natural habitat. She recovered the biophilia of her early youth in Greenford and began, in her words, raiding the libraries of Newcastle so as to read as much as she could on the subject of ethology. She was preparing to write a work of moral philosophy in which the study of gulls, elephants, bees, wolves and apes would show us something about ourselves. Beast and Man, The Roots of Human Nature was published in 1978. Oxford, Midgley said, had caused her pen to freeze. At the time, Oxford moral philosophers were concerned to give an analysis of the logic of statements like stealing is wrong or you ought to keep your promises. Before the war, a young A.J. Ayer had published Language, Truth and Logic. The aim of that book was to root out any kind of statement, the meaning of which could not be analysed in terms of possible experiences. That is to say, in terms of experiences that could provide a verification of what the sentence was purporting to say. Remember the slogan, anything that can be said clearly. Metaphysical and religious statements did not seem to be verifiable in this sense, and so Ayer dismissed them as nonsense. Ethical statements like stealing is wrong were not verifiable either. What kind of experience could verify the truth of the sentence, stealing is wrong? Ayer thereby offered another analysis. When we say something is wrong, we are expressing our disapproval or dislike of that thing. In this sense, is wrong is a bit like saying boo, boo to stealing. Ayer's position became known as emotivism. What it amounted to was an attack on the objectivity of morality. There is no act or happening or state of affairs that is right and wrong in itself. It just depends on how we feel about it. The same goes for sentences using moral obligation terms like ought. There is nothing as such that we ought to do. Something that the prescriptivist R.M. Hare, a contemporary of Midgley's, insisted in his early work, The Language of Morals. Rather, it depends on what principles we, or the societies we live in, have chosen to adopt. And if we don't act in light of the principles that we have freely chosen, we are behaving irrationally, either by our own standards or by those of our society. Midgley rejected this picture in Beast and Man, effectively saying, hold on. And now I am quoting her again. She writes, "The evils in this world are real. That they are so is neither a fancy imposed on us by our culture, nor one created by our will and imposed on the world." She described Ayer's work as moral weed killer, and the moral philosophy scene in Oxford at the time as an arid garden. Philosophers appeared to be concerned only with terms like good and ought, and not with exploring the rich moral vocabulary which we so patently have. In moving to Newcastle, she had quietly escaped that arid garden. She had slipped over the wall, in her words, and into the jungle. The moral philosophers who were busy spreading weed killer in their arid gardens accepted a dichotomy which Midgley did not. They assumed that a complete factual description of how things are in the physical and material world would not require the use of value terms. Such terms are instead expressive of our attitudes and preferences. For Midgley, the ready acceptance of this dichotomy belongs to a dualistic, post-Cartesian metaphysics that separates lifeless matter, the body, from mind. Following the married Aristotle, the moral philosophy that she develops in Beast and Man begins instead with the assumption that there are living things, creatures, each with their own modes or ways of living, passions that the ethologist describes. Living creatures have characteristic needs, and what they value is connected to what fulfills those needs. Moreover, living creatures move purposefully in the world and in a structured, intelligible way. This is because they're motivated to go after what they need. On this understanding, what is valued is just what is needed by a particular kind of creature, a living creature who is not a phantasm or a ghost or a machine, but a flesh and blood, furred or feathered or scaled animal who has evolved to live in a particular way, in a particular kind of ecology, amongst other creatures of its kind, and amongst a multitude of diverse kinds of living organisms, small, even microscopic, and large. Seen from the perspective of the planetary whole, all these forms of life are interconnected. They are interdependent. In the human case, our needs are of course many, which is why the kinds of things we value are so many and so varied. We need attachment and intimacy, which is why we value friendship and fellowship. We have aesthetic needs. We have a need for stimulation and independence, a need to play and create and explore, a need even for philosophy, something which I'm going to return to. We have a need to belong and to feel secure. We need parental affection and recognition. We need rest. This is all part of our human nature, and the list goes on and on. As social animals, many of the goods that are related to our needs are connected to our sociality and can only be satisfied in community with others and through the cultures and institutions that, according to Midgley, we create to satisfy our natural passion of motives. It is against this background, this image of our nature, that Midgley's distinctive moral philosophy, a form of ethical naturalism, comes into view. Because we value many things and have many needs, conflict inevitably arises. We can't have or do everything. We only have one life to live, and it is a life lived with others, including with other animals. In her book, Animals and Why They Matter, she points out that humans have always lived with other creatures in what she calls mixed communities. But because we only have one life to lead, certain values must take priority and shape our modes of interaction, and ultimately, the path through space and time that the unfolding life of each individual takes. The central business of morality, Midgley thinks, is to compare and relate the goods we go after, the values, and to ensure that our motives in seeking out such goods remain balanced and in check. For instance, the need for security, which is a good, can be satisfied in different ways depending on how we are motivated to go after that good. Our going after security may, for example, result in dominance, especially where the instinct towards possessiveness is strong. It may issue in meanness or in an over-thrifty anxiety about the future, or it may be fulfilled through an openness to fellowship or by habitual contribution to communal projects that may foster a sense of belonging and hence stability. It is striking that for Midgley hardly any motivation to seek out something that is of value to us, being the kind of creatures we are, is worthy or vicious in itself, except perhaps the motivation to destroy, which is something she discusses in her 1984 book, Wickedness. What matters rather is proportionality, that one motive does not crowd out the others and dull our capacity to live as we are capable of living. Reason is the name of the faculty that plays this balancing and ordering role, but feeling or emotion is integral, and indeed for her the pair are really one. This allows her to develop a distinctive account of the reality of evil. We might put it this way. Evil is a formal feature that belongs to the way in which certain human motives are ordered in the life of an individual, group, institution or society. Crucially, Midgley believes that, and I'm quoting her here, because society is the condition of man's living at all, and because there is some evil, namely friction, in any society, evil too is in some sense natural to him. He has, like any other species, his own natural evils. In developing this account, she insists that ethology has an especially important contribution to make to moral philosophy. By seeing our continuity with other kinds of living creatures, insofar as we may value the same things or display similar motivational patterns, ethology enables us to ask questions about ourselves that our culture can sometimes stop us from asking. This is because certain questions may lead us to uncover motivational patterns that we might wish to ignore or suppress. And this is precisely where she thinks Freud's work has proved enormously useful, if reductive. It's reductive because for him, roughly speaking, it's all about sex. But for Midgley, though sex is important, it is not the most fundamental motivation in human life, any more than the motivation to compete or win or survive is. In fact, since we are social animals, and since many human goods are both realised in and constituted by society, a willingness to cooperate and act with others to secure, share in or create those goods is for Midgley a central human motivation. We are genial creatures. It is in this context that the concept of selfishness is intelligible. It describes an individual who is not so genial, so motivated to share and cooperate. On this understanding, genes cannot be said to be selfish, as the neo-Darwinian theorist Richard Dawkins has argued or urged. The notion of a selfish gene is a misnomer. Still, Midgley recognised that the idea had a kind of power, including a kind of political power, that she saw it was important to diffuse, and she became one of Dawkins's fiercest and most relentless public critics. It is difficult to emphasise how thoroughly unlike any other moral philosophy that was written at the time Beast and Man was, and still is. So far I have painted a picture of Midgley's metaphysics in broad strokes. Reality is vast, and understanding involves relating diverse and partial perspectives, a form of synthesis. Humans are animals whose nature is continuous with other living creatures of diverse kinds and is characterised by a distinctive structure of motives which reason and feeling can order in the life of an individual, depending on what is valued, which is also to say, needed. With this thumbnail sketch, certain systematic philosophical themes emerge in Midgley's large corpus, and I want to end by saying something very briefly about two of these. Midgley is sometimes regarded as a philosopher of science. Much of her work is directed against a prevalent scientism, the idea that anything that needs to be explained can be explained using the tools of the physical sciences. Such explanations typically work by explaining large-scale happenings in terms of occurrences that take place at smaller scales and that involve the entities that populate the theories of those disciplines, various forces, subatomic particles, genes, and so on. As such, the scientific ideal is reductive and homogenizing. It involves explaining a whole by reducing it to its parts, an atomistic vision of the world. As I've said, Midgley's synthetic explanatory strategy involves constellating the partial truths that belong to different perspectives into a whole. Far from being reductive, her explanatory aim is to enlarge our perspective. For this, we need to draw on insights from beyond the special sciences, from ethology, psychology, and the social sciences, but also from history and literature. And here for Midgley, poetry has a special role to play. Just as our nature is comprised of a natural set of motives that can be reordered, depending on what we value, our collective lives together are structured by narratives or myths. These myths help to place us in the world, and they encode their own ordering of values: mind over matter, reason over emotion, man over beast. Part of the work of the philosopher, she thinks, is to analyse the myths and narratives that shape our lives. By revealing the original need from which they sprung, the philosopher can expose where they are no longer useful, that is, where the passion of life they recommend dulls our collective capacity to live as we can. But to do this, Mary thinks, the philosopher also needs the skills of the poet. Poetry has the capacity to refresh our ideas and language, to repattern our associations and convey imaginative visions. The poet has in her store the tools of metaphor and analogy. She can spotlight unexpected relations or zoom out and home in on some aspect of synthetic truth, help us to see as connected things that we had previously not connected or which we had not even noticed. This is effectively what Midgley is doing in Beast and Man. We are not just like animals, we are animals, is her opening line. The vision that she communicates is to invite a repatterning of our values. It is no coincidence that Midgley's words often delight. They sometimes have an Edwardian ring, but their cadence is also prophetic and sometimes grave. She concludes that book with these words: "Man can neither be understood or saved alone." In the 1980s, Midgley led a campaign to stop Newcastle University's philosophy department from being closed down. Her last book, What is Philosophy For?, was written when she was 98. And there is a sense in which all of her work can be read as a plea for why philosophy matters. It is notable, she says, that Socrates did not speak of the dangers of unexamined thought or unexamined language, but of an unexamined life. Whenever there are gaps in understanding, viewpoints that seem intractably irreconcilable, where there is conflict and confusion, where our reason is dislocated, this is where philosophy is needed. This is the need philosophy answers because we are creatures that value and need order, integration and sense. But to seek such order is, paradoxically, to be liberated. For Midgley, it is to find ourselves as part of the whole in which we are at home.